Thanks, folks. Welcome to our hybrid October meeting. We did not decorate for Halloween, but we do have Halloween candy. So if any members of the public want to rush over and get it, it's here. We'll go ahead and start with welcome and attendance. So Commissioner Montgomery is out. Is Commissioner McCullough online? Not yet, or no. Commissioner Shucken?
Here.
Commissioner Smith?
Here.
Commissioner Dansby?
Here.
Commissioner Evans here. Commissioner Ortiz?
Here.
Great. And we have Mummy, Ethan, but not ACPD this meeting. So since we don't have a physical quorum, we will skip the meeting minutes and do that next time. But just quick preview, we're going to do a 2-year review of some of the case investigations, and then we'll go into our normal, oh, Charles is here. We'll go into our normal sort of chair updates, IPA, if the public join, any public comment and discussion. Hi, welcome. Could we switch over to the slides when you have a chance?
Yep, sorry, I'm still.
Welcome to Community Students and Community.
No, I was promised cake.
I have a bit of the story after the break. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so, you're fine, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, just to recap with the agenda, we're gonna skip meeting minutes because we don't have a quorum. Okay, recap, so just for future folks' benefit, we started our first real investigation. We did a mock investigation, I think in September of that year, and our first formal case review in November. And so we have completed sort of 2 years of reviews, and we wanted to recap sort of what we found, what we're looking at, and opportunities to either refine our process or we'll walk through some of the policy discussions we've had with ACPD. So just to set the stage for context, in this time period, there were more than 200 total public complaints. The majority of those were exonerated by DEMS, which I forget the acronym, but it means that when ACPD and MUMI look at the available evidence, that the claim is sort of found to be baseless or there's not evidence to support the claim. Others were unfounded or sometimes are withdrawn. So the resulting cases that we review are concurrently investigated by the Office of Professional Responsibility within ACPD and the Independent Policing Auditor MUMI. So we reviewed 16 of those cases. 14 of those were administrative complaint reviews. One of them was the cert review. And then there was one administrative complaint where the records were expunged. So we did a policy review only. Within those 16 cases, there were 85, discrete alleged policy violations and 40 separate officers' conduct. Any questions starting out, just context scope? I think everyone has seen and reviewed this already.
DEMS, just real quick, DEMS is digital evidence management system. So that just typically means like this is the evidence that's available to us through Axon, that I've body worn camera footage, incident reports, those sort of things is what I would review and then make a determination.
Okay, thank you, Mummy. I can never remember it, but that's helpful. So just to recap before we look at the sort of summary of findings, we want to make sure everyone understands that, they're sustained and exonerated, right, where we either determine that there is sufficient evidence to justify a conclusion of guilt or the evidence, indicates that the incident occurred but was lawful and proper. The kind of intermediary is where we, and we have found this in a couple of instances where, there's just not enough evidence to make a determination. So, for example, we had one case where the body-worn camera footage was muted, and so we couldn't, make a determination about something, or if it's not visible on body-worn camera footage, where we can't draw a conclusion. So that's not really a positive or a negative outcome, but just wanted to clarify that distinction. And then I think unfounded sort of falls into the category with DEMS of, okay.
Oh, I was having one question, what's the total number?
Yeah.
And this is kind of based on your experience working with other jurisdictions. So that we understand, the public understands, when they see that 200 number, you could easily look at that and say, oh, one time a day, someone has something to say about cops. But just per capita, is that par for the course? Is that, like, what indication is just 200, about 200 for a jurisdiction our size? What can you divine from that, if anything, compared to other jurisdictions you've worked with or heard about?
I don't have an answer.
I would.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So just to put it into perspective, that's we're looking at a 2-year review, so that's about 100 a year,
Right.
and that can go up or down, on any given year, but on average, and I think since we've been here, that's what the trend that we've seen. Based on the size of our police department, that is not a particularly large or small number. It's a just kind of median, kind of average number. Um, I would say what sticks out more to me versus rather than the number of complaints is the types of complaints. And I will say that because of the fact that the majority of them are exonerated, that's the number that I would probably pay attention to more than the number of complaints, because most of the complaints that we get are ones that are less serious in nature. Generally, even the ones that we ultimately end up reviewing are, if you would, the worst of them, and they're not necessarily in comparison to other police departments, like the absolute worst of the worst when you talk about like police misconduct. So I would look at like the ones that do make it to y'all through the filter, the scale of those, but also just the majority of the fact that the majority of them are exonerated, or they are kind of less serious complaints is, less, not that they're taken less seriously, but less serious complaints of less serious misconduct. So I feel like that number speaks to me. And then I also think it's interesting to observe trends, like once civilian oversight has, you know, started in a jurisdiction, looking at the trends of like how many complaints were received prior to, and then how many complaints are received now that civilian oversight has started, and then like ultimately, are we seeing complaint numbers going down? So those are some of the trends that I would probably be looking at more to specifically diagnose our work with our police department, more than just how do the numbers line up with other jurisdictions, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
And just for the record, the reason Mummy's answering that question is because Mummy, as the IPA, sees all the complaints that come in and basically filters for us the COB. So it's not like the COB looked at 200 complaints. We are fortunate that Mummy has actually seen all those
And validates that when it's
Right.
exonerated by DEMS, that's, somebody outside the police department has looked at that.
Yep.
Lisa?
Yeah. Just a couple of things to think about. One of them is the number going down doesn't necessarily mean a good thing. The number could go down because fewer people have faith in the police to even bring a complaint. That's why it's so hard to interpret these numbers. The other thing is you'd really need to know the number of actions that were taken over the time period. There might have been more actions. So again, an absolute number isn't really going to tell you. And then in comparison to other places, we would need population numbers. And Arlington's really difficult because we have a transient population. Because I remember talking to ACPD about, because I was also trying to think about how to interpret some data, but it's tough because so many people come into work here who don't live here. And so our population size sort of is very, nebulous through the day. But anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to throw those out there because you really got to be careful figuring out what to think about any of this stuff.
What's the benchmark? Yeah, absolutely.
I want to just say,
But also when I say population, I mean population of our police department, not necessarily population of the community, because you're right, it's a very transient community. But if we're just drawing the conclusion that the more police officers you have, the more complaints you might receive, at least that's what I was drawing from Charles's question about like based on our size. And that's how I was responding to it. Based on the size of our police department being a smaller size police department, does this align with obviously, if you had a police department that was, 600 officers, you would assume that you may receive more complaints. So I think that was the correlation.
Yeah. I want to sort of benchmark here 2 things for this slide. One, we've talked about this in some of our previous meetings, but, to Mummy's point, we look at, cases that are not representative of the typical, ACPD interaction, but, wanting there to be more visibility into the most severe challenges and kind of reiterating that our role as civilians is to bring, the balanced perspective that, there's the public safety interest, there's officer, wellness and safety, and there is an acknowledgement that a lot of the existing policies and protocols are legacy from, an era before Arlington had its, current composition, lots of things change. And so, creating an opportunity. I think for this meeting specifically, one thing you're going to see is that there is not much data analysis here, right? Like all we have are sort of raw numbers. We don't have enough time, based data to look at, trends or things like that within our own sort of case review data. But by aggregating this, we create an opportunity to look at, for example, does the number of, instances where the IPA or COB have a different conclusion than ACPD change over time. I think that will be an interesting thing to look into over time as we, have built a strong, conversational rapport with ACPD as we give them, some of our insights and recommendations as we look at contracts like we're going to talk about, how do these numbers change over time to kind of inform the efficacy of our own work. Anything else before
Can I
we?
also just say one more thing? Sorry, and I'm sorry, y'all, because I'm not, on my laptop. I'm not able to like raise my hand or necessarily see when other people are about to talk. So I really apologize if I'm like cutting anybody off at the beginning or end of a sentence. It's not intentional. One other thing I wanted to say, just to house the conversation, and this kind of speaks to like what Lisa was talking about in terms of like our data set. It's kind of hard sometimes, especially at this stage where we're still kind of diagnosing what the issues are and how much of an impact they are, because we have a small universe of interactions, and they're only the ones where someone has felt compelled to file a complaint. And as Lisa mentioned, there's various reasons why people may or may not file a complaint. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the complaints that we review are representative. Does not mean actually that they're representative of all the interactions that members of the community are having with the police. And so we have identified, and we'll talk about through this conversation, some of the issues that have come up for us that we feel are, serious and deserve attention through investigations. But I don't know that we can necessarily represent to what extent and to what gravity these issues are present or not present or what have you, because we don't have the larger picture here to know what other interactions look like that may have been positive or that may have been negative, but just the person didn't file a complaint. So it is sometimes hard to draw conclusions without a full scope of data. But I still think like the issues that we are discussing and extracting from the investigations that we review are really important and very serious. And even if it's just 1 or 2 incidents that are happening in the course of the investigations, some of the more serious ones that come to mind, even that one encounter alone should give us enough pause to like be like, this is an issue that needs to be addressed such that it doesn't, continue to become an issue for other interactions. But I just wanted to house that, like frame this discussion or add that to the framing of this discussion, because I in addition to talking about the number of complaints that we receive and then the smaller number of complaints that get funneled to you all, this is still a smaller universe within the larger number of thousands of police interactions that happen, throughout the year.
Thank you, Mummy. I was trying to pull up the duty responsibilities description that we had. So this next slide just kind of showcases that we've got, certain types of policy violations that, show up in lots of allegations. And I think duty responsibilities and preliminary and follow-up investigations, personal contacts, for example, are kind of very broad policies that encompass a lot of different types of behavior. So they can be sort of catch-all for different kinds of, behavioral activities. Use of force, obviously being much narrower and more specific. So, looking at this slide just shows, the number of OPR sustained violations, IPA and COB. We're not always exactly parallel, between the COB and the IPA. You can see pretty clearly that, there are the majority of our reviews, we have found more serious findings than ACPD in these case reviews. So there are plenty of cases where we agree with OPR's findings. There have been several where, they exonerated or we did not sustain, kind of finding that there wasn't sufficient evidence. But here I wanted to look at really just how frequently we're finding, a preponderance of evidence that we thought was sufficient to, to draw a guilty conclusion that OPR did not. And
A policy violation.
sorry, policy violation. Yeah, it does say in the sustained guilty.
Does it? Okay,
It said
okay.
preponderance. I know it. I'm just going to go back up to that because it always throws me off, this language, but to justify a conclusion of guilt, which is, it's not a criminal finding.
Okay.
So
It's funny. I've lived
But
it many times, but not focused on it.
I know it.
Like, it's an oxymoron, guilt based on a preponderance, but whatever.
Right. Yeah. Regardless, to sustain a policy violation, the thing that stuck out here to me was, use of force, and we definitely talked about, the bias-free policing kind of interaction in a lot of the cases that we looked at with use of force. So we'll talk about that in some of our policy discussions. In conduct unbecoming being the sort of one of the, what did he call it? Single sanction. There are a few policies where there's single sanction, where if you get, if you are found guilty of, if a policy violation of conduct unbecoming is sustained, the only option is termination. The same thing with bias-free policing. They regard that as a single sanction policy. And so, in probably our most serious case, we looked at that and didn't have different findings from OPR in that instance, but in a few of the use of force cases, we definitely had, nuances or, differences of opinion. Most of these, I think, have given us a very rich opportunity to help ACPD understand, the composite of the public perspective that, we don't always agree for the same reasons, but, having those conversational opportunities, I think, enriches ACPD's perspective. It gives us opportunities to identify policy needs or research needs to, inform those kinds of updates. But just sort of looking at the numbers here, of the alleged policy violations, so going to Mummy's, point about we're looking at a small number of cases. So of the, alleged violations, we're only sustaining sort of a small portion of those. We are sustaining about twice as many as OPR did, but again, these are preliminary numbers, very small sample. So just to kind of clock where we're starting from and what we've seen after 2 years. Not ready to draw any substantive conclusions, but just sort of benchmarking and looking at where we are. Lisa?
Did you want that? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if you want the language of 407 or not. You asked for it. You want to read it, or you were just.
I was just going to try to give an example of that. Let me have Lisa go and then I'll come back to you.
I don't want to take us off track if this isn't part of what we're going to talk about, but have you had conversations? Did you think there's scope to have conversations with ACPD about rewriting some of these policies? Because the bias-free policing, I mean, this just makes me crazy, because when you write policies that are performative, that you do it for political signaling, you want everybody to know we take this so seriously, we're going to fire you. They're useless. So I get off my soapbox. I'm just wondering if we've.
I have a slide to talk about kind of recapping the conversations we've had around bias-free policing. So I think we'll have more opportunity to get into that. But yes, I do think that, part of our continuing dialogue is in the individual cases themselves. The reports include our recommendations, but also these sorts of meetings where we up level and just kind of highlight to the public, what are we seeing is needed. Would you read the duty responsibilities? I just think for members of the public that listen to this, that's very vague.
The
And
two
so,
paragraphs, okay. 407, duties and responsibilities. An employee shall respond to the lawful order of a supervisor as well as request for assistance from a citizen or when dispatched to a call. An employee shall take proper noted police action while on duty to protect life, property, and individual liberty, prevent crime and disorder, detect and arrest violators of the law, and enforce federal, state, and county laws and ordinances within the department's jurisdiction. An employee shall perform duties in a fair and professional manner as required or directed by law, policy, procedure, or rules and regulations. Delegation of specific enforcement responsibilities to a particular unit within the department does not relieve another employee from taking appropriate action when necessary. An employee shall direct any inquiry as to duties to the immediate supervisor.
perfect. Yeah, just to demonstrate that, that one comes up a lot, preliminary investigation, personal contacts. These are sort of general catch-all policies that give them, the ability to interpret different facets of their behavior in different circumstances. So like preliminary and follow-up investigations would be after, something is reported versus, patrol, and then personal contacts being interpersonal communication. So, okay. There are 4 slides here, and I don't know that we need to dive into these, in too much depth, but I do want to reiterate to Selena, Joshua, and Ethan that we now have good sort of kind of recap summaries of all of these completed investigations, so we can walk through those with you guys at some point, the ones that we've reviewed before y'all got here. But just kind of looking at a cross-section of, in a typical, or in the cases that we're reviewing, right? Some of them have one officer with, 1 or 2 kind of minor policy violation allegations. Some of them are where, many more officers are responding to something, that's either a more kind of serious report of a crime or, a different scale of situation, and then have multiple, more serious complaints. The red text with asterisks is for cases where in the IPA's concurrent investigation, there were allegations that she recommended be investigated in addition to the ones that OPR initially identified, but were not included in OPR's report. There was one, this red text was the one case where we had reviewed the evidence, but then the records were expunged. And so we couldn't review that publicly. So we did a policy violation that was related to, a situation involving escalation. So we reviewed de-escalation training. And then another one, this was a case where, the independent policing auditor's investigation indicated that there were other allegations that should have been interviewed. So we'll talk about, how our recommendations have been kind of received and are in process. But just sort of recapping these 4 slides that we'll put online, you can see from that far right column, about half the time our findings are diverging from OPRs. Sometimes that's, a minor, issue that we interpret, the policy in a slightly different way than they have, or sometimes they are more substantive, but each of these has been a very meaningful opportunity for conversation. The other sort of top level finding, or the other sort of top level outcome from this is that, the county board is certainly much more aware of the kinds of serious policy violations where we believe that there is a valid complaint that OPR didn't, sort of self-account for. Same thing with the county manager and deputy county manager, that the sort of administrative leadership and elected leadership in our community now have much more insight into not common experiences, but the sort of severe instances and where we may need additional support. So we'll get to that next. Before we go into policy discussions, does anyone have questions about the kind of data here or anything presented? I know it's very high level.
I'll just add that it makes sense that there's a difference occasionally from our finding from, OPR. That's the whole purpose. And I think one of the points of discussion we've had is from ACPD, the concern that we're looking at it from hindsight. And of course we are, but I think that's okay. I mean, that from the perspective of, we try to bring what the community might think, what we think as community members, and what the larger community might think. And yeah, it is hindsight, but looking at the body worn camera is extremely helpful. And often it comes down to, is the conduct less than perfect, which might be ACPD's concern in some point, but still within policy, as opposed to we see it as less than perfect, but actually violative of the policy from time to time. And that's where I think a lot of the difference is. They might say, yes, this could have been done better. And we would say, yes, but it actually, the conduct as it came off, in this case, might or might not have actually violated the policy. So I think my point is that's a legitimate back and forth. And I think we've had that. And I think our discussions have been fruitful in that regard.
Yeah, well, and building on that, I think, the majority of the time, I think that we are looking at instances where, some of the sensitivity is, Monday night quarterbacking, but in most of these places where we've disagreed, it does point us to where the policy or training or culture sort of needs to change. There have been only a few instances where, the violation was so severe that we were really interested in the discipline itself or the officer, handling itself, that in general, the larger sort of body of our work, I think, can inform changes to policy and practice that, that like the punitive after the fact, to your point, like there have been instances where it was within policy. We don't agree with the way the policy was written. And so we're not saying the officer should be penalized for that, but like, I think there was one instance where they had already changed the body worn camera muting policy because it was clear from the situation that the officers didn't violate the policy, but it did make it difficult to determine whether or not the rest of their conduct was sufficient. And so it wasn't about like those officers did a bad thing, but that situation gave us insight in order to, so, and in that instance, ACPD had been proactive and had already updated their policy before we reviewed the case. In other ones, like we'll get to, right, we have been able to say, we're not suggesting that this officer needs to be penalized for, looking at this in hindsight, but situationally, does this point to additional training needs or policy changes or cultural provision? So I think we can get more into that with specifics. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. We might just want to look at those. There's a question about what personal contacts means.
Okay, we'll do that during public discussion. We were given some guidance about our chat policy. I think is treated as public comment. So when we get to public comment in our agenda, we'll. But are they questions from the COB? No. Okay. Perfect. All right, I will get to that in public comment. All right, so for the COB IPA, kind of the first thing that came up in one of our case reviews was the incident itself was a complaint about racial bias in traffic stops. And in our review of the case, we did not agree that that was the instance where somebody had been stopped multiple times. And that raised several things. One of them was the consideration that sometimes, law enforcement practices can penalize, lower income, folks that the person had already been given a ticket and, needed to update their registration or something like that. So even though the instance itself did not raise, a sustained violation of, racial bias, it started a conversation amongst the COB that, there is more national visibility of, the pretextual use of traffic stops and the relation of that in, bias policing. There were multiple reports that circulated sort of within the Commonwealth. There are different opinions about the quality and credibility of those reports, but it did raise the conversation about, do we have data to look into whether or not this is a problem? And so Arlington County is currently funding an analysis of local data, police data, to look at whether or not there are opportunities to improve bias-free policing in Arlington. So we don't have any, data, analysis or findings from that project yet, but that's something that we'll talk about. And that is an effort where both the independent policing auditor and ACPD are involved in, the contractor's activities to make sure that, the data selected, the methods, the analysis, and the findings are sort of appropriate. But that will give us an opportunity to look into this. And I'm really excited about having, local specific data that we sort of jointly reviewed and aggregated, because I think there is, a lot of data that points that nationally those sorts of pretextual stops are not only part of, bias policing, but also do not have a positive impact for public safety. So I think we've talked about this a couple of different times, but in Ramsey County, where George Floyd was murdered, they, as part of their sort of resulting police policies, removed all vehicle related traffic stops. So like registration, tail light, things like that from their police code, not driver behavior. So if you're speeding, you run a red light, those things, but cars are so much safer than when these laws were created that there is not as much of a meaningful public safety threat from somebody's registration being expired or them not signaling, or sorry, them having a tail light out, as there is a public safety threat to, people being stopped where it, creates a individual safety threat to them. And so, having the data to sort of look into this, I think will be useful, but I think there is emerging national best practice around traffic specific policing and, bias that will be useful for a future conversation. Dave?
Is there a time frame for like a first cut at this? I think that like
I know
end of
that
this year kind of ish. Mommy, do you know?
I don't think
No.
that it's end of this year, but I do know that it's underway. Mommy, do you have any timeline data off the top of your head? I know you might still be driving.
It's in the scope of work what our ideal time frame is, and I want to say that was 18 months. It may be a little longer than that because we were working through trying to create like data sharing systems so that ACPD could share the raw data that we get from these traffic stops over to the consulting firm that we're using, which is CNA. We're also still working through additional pieces of how we execute some of the scope of work. Like one of the recommendations that I specifically, or one of the deliverables that I specifically asked for out of the traffic data stop was the use of some number or universe of body worn camera footage to look for qualitative indicators that are not part of the current study. And that's one note that I also wanted to state, and I'll get back to that in a second, but could inform policy and training recommendations, as well as form a some potential recommendations for what an additional aspect of this study would look like. And so that's kind of that's the other piece I wanted to name, which is that the traffic stop data analysis is just quantitative data that is collected from the Community Policing Act that is specific to maybe like demographics, the result of a stop, was there a search, like quantitative stuff. But as we've seen in our limited universe of just reviewing the investigations that we've reviewed, a lot of times the things that are coming up for us as potential concerns for bias are related to qualitative things like tone, escalation, or lack of de-escalation, language that's being used, different things like that. And that is not captured by the quantitative data that is being analyzed here. What we're looking at with quantitative data is more like contraband hit rate and things like that, like things like, in the number of times that they stop people, are they actually finding contraband, which may be an indicator of potential pretextual stops and different things like that. But there are ways that we can get some indications. that will help this diagnostic with quantitative data. But I just wanted to name that there are benchmark issues, as Lisa was kind of alluding to earlier, us trying to figure out like what's the right benchmark right? What is the right recipe for the benchmark that we should use in Arlington County for the quantitative stuff? And then additionally, I just want to set the expectation that with this traffic stop data analysis, we are starting to uncover part of the picture, but I still think it's very important to get a qualitative lens and to figure out how to standardize qualitative assessments, because they're definitely part of the narrative too. And I find that usually those are the things that are harder to unpack or to address or what have you when you have some qualitative things that you got to name. And sometimes that could literally just be like how an officer's tone escalates, or different things like that. And then a lot of that could be seen as subjective in how you interpret that. So figuring out what data to use, how many incidents to look at, how we assess those, what type of recommendations should come out of that is still like part of the work that's being done here. But I do think that this is a huge step in the right direction, and it'll give us at least a starting point of what sort of things we might want to start narrowing in on.
Thank you, Mummy. Any other questions on the traffic stop and racial bias background or conversation? Okay. This was another, oh, Lisa.
I just wanted to clarify about what I was saying earlier, because it sounded like I thought they only came up with
that's what they're
bias-free policing to, because the public wanted it. What I meant was that when you write it to signal so strongly how important this is to you, it isn't written in a way that's going to be effective. That's what I meant. As I didn't want, if ACPD sees this, I don't want them to think that I think they only wrote that policy to shut everybody up. I don't believe that. That's it.
Excellent point. I do think we'll get more into that into policy discussion number 3, because this was more specific to traffic stops than the broader sort of bias conversation that we've had. But I appreciate that sort of nuance. Okay, so policy discussion number 2, looking at the collecting data on the frequency of guns drawn and pointed. So this is linguistically sort of a cumbersome thing to talk about, but just to be clear, it is considered a use of force to draw your weapon and point your weapon. And so in the current policy, or in ACPD's existing policy, it was required that the report on any incident note that a gun was drawn and pointed at someone as a use of force. So they were, in a way, collecting data on that, but there wasn't an aggregated or sort of focused measure on that specific sort of use of force. And in the cases that we reviewed, I mean, this came up from sort of multiple discussions, but we saw that the few instances we looked at, we disagreed about the use of, weapons in interactions with the community. And it does unnecessarily traumatize somebody who, in one instance, was like a misidentified suspect, somebody who hadn't done anything wrong and was just totally going about their business, but then, feared for their life and, was really put out. Or situations where, there is something going on, but that, use of force did to the COB seem significantly out of proportion to, what the situation required. So we started, a conversation with this about ACPD. They are currently tracking this data, but what they told us in an update recently was that they're not exactly sure how to analyze or incorporate it yet. So that's something we'll look to work with them on incorporating. They did mention, an existing early intervention program where they look at sort of a number of factors, that can affect an officer, like, involvement in a sort of traumatic or disruptive incident. where they can, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Early intervention, I'm not familiar with that, like early intervention for
Officers.
APPD with regard to an officer?
Yeah, that like there are multiple pieces of information that they look at in aggregate to sort of create a flag of like an early intervention opportunity with an officer. They are not clear yet how this would fit into that. There's not like a clear path or a current path for that, but there is a growing body of research. Historically, there was just not a lot of research and data around this. There was one study in particular that was from the Dallas Police Department that looked at a 15-year period of data that showed, policies that require officers to self-report having pointed a gun at somebody over time dramatically decreased what they called false threat identification, where an officer draws their weapon and points it at somebody because they think they had a weapon, and they did in situations where they did not. So the study there showed that it went from like 18% to 4%. So it seemed significant, but collecting that data versus exploring other policies, to Mummy's point, looking at some of this is more actionable when it's qualitative versus quantitative. That like there may not be a numerical threshold that you could apply to say, if you're pointing your weapon X times per month, that's a problem. If you're on the SWAT team, that may be just more normal, or so a quantitative threshold may not be as useful as a qualitative threshold, like having officers self-report creates that perception and absorption of accountability that this is an escalating action, and so I really need to think about why I'm doing this. I know this was sort of before we had some of our current members on, so if there's any additional discussion we want to have here, or Mummy, if you have clarifying or additional thoughts to share, please feel free to chime in. I think then we have one more. All right.
Well, actually, I was gonna say, I'm glad that this, I'm glad they're all moving forward, but in particular, this one, I remember some of the cases surrounding this. I also remember ACPD saying how they would have to tweak their, how they're collecting this type of data. So it's good to again see how when this, board voices, where they are strongly, you're having some action from ACPD. So I hope that this evolves in a way where it produces information that's useful and actionable.
As you said that, one of the things I was sort of wondering about when I looked back at that report was like, I think there could be some interesting value in requiring officers to self-report, because also that gives you the opportunity to have them self-assess, was there a different way to handle this? And I think that this, we've talked with ACPD and they do this in a lot of situations, like specifically, conversations with officers about like, if you had to do this again, what would you do differently? Things like that, where again, it's not punitive, it's, cultural. Right. But that even in doing so, if that doesn't like help some of the critical thinking about this as an escalation, right, soak in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting conversation. I don't know if we've specifically talked to ACPD about self-reporting data, but and I think ACP does a pretty decent job of creating that culture where I hope so. I mean, I don't know for sure, but my sense is that self-reported data would have to be in the context of, I think this will help, as opposed to, if you report that, you're screwed. You know what I mean? It has to be in the context of
psychological safety.
Right. And there is the backup of, okay, there is body-worn camera. So, we can verify if we went back and checked whether you should have or shouldn't have reported, but it has to be in the context of this is designed to improve your overall, efficiency and your well-being, ultimately your well-being and the community's well-being. So I think it's really interesting if that could be self-reported, and if there are other areas for self-report. It's a long conversation, but it is an interesting data collection format, I think.
Yeah. Anything from the virtual crowd before we move on? Okay, last one. So broader than the traffic specific conversation, which came up again in response to a case that we didn't determine there was bias. There has been a broad and recurring conversation we have with ACPD, and the tension here I want to emphasize comes from the fact that this is a single sanction policy, where again, if ACPD finds an officer in violation of the bias-free policing policy, their only option by policy is to recommend termination of that employee. And the challenge that we've had talking about this is certainly there is a human capacity for implicit bias that we cannot penalize people for. Like, you know, everyone has, you know, learned an implicit bias, and that is not something we can penalize folks for. But, you know, there were other conversations that came up, you know, specifically around the overlap of complaints where ACPD did not investigate bias-free policing, and we thought they should have. For instance, just because a complainant didn't say that they felt or experienced bias, that means that it shouldn't be reviewed as part of, you know, relevant circumstances. But also the kind of interaction with some of the use of force instances, like whether or not bias, you know, was part of use of force decisions, not all, you know, gun related use of force, but, you know, just sort of the treatment and handling of people during police interactions, use of handcuffs. I think there was one in particular where, you know, it was in that apartment and there was like a small space and, you know, things like that. So there are a couple of different facets to this that made us eager to engage outside expertise, right? Where as civilians, we don't have the sort of capacity or research ability to go and do this independently. ACPD may not have, you know, similarly the resources and the time, but also the independence to look at, you know, what could we be doing here? A couple of things we flagged specifically were the investigation protocols. So when we're interviewing officers, we have already seen a lot of improvements, like the officer interviews are more expansive, they're longer, but there have still been instances where we felt like there were leading questions or, you know, insufficient questions, like, you know, did race factor into your decision making? It's not likely to yield a meaningful answer. And so if we don't investigate it, we can't determine, was this explicit or implicit bias? I mean, talk me through your thinking, you know, what was going on, what specifically led to the decision that this person needed to be in handcuffs, gives a more open-ended opportunity for an officer to explain, was it circumstance or was it something about this person, you know, that triggered that, you know, decision. And so in parallel to the traffic stop, there is a current scope of work. It has not been released for, I can't remember if it hasn't been released for solicitation to get proposals, or if it hasn't been, I think it's that. But there was sort of a staggering of this for administrative processing. We have been, you know, increasingly raising this as part of our interactions with the county manager and the county board, because both our and ACPD interests are served by, you know, having this conversation. Every case that we review where there's bias, if we get stuck on this, we're going to keep disagreeing with OPR's findings because we're not agreeing on the sufficiency, where it, to Lisa's point, or maybe to a public perception, if the current bias-free policing single sanction policy is so severe, it creates too high of a threshold that basically that means certainly for, you know, lawsuits from officers, you know, so, like, I understand the administrative and organizational requirements, but if the alternative is that we never have an opportunity to work on, you know, cultural, you know, protocols and practices, or improving our policies and protocols, we miss opportunities to be proactive and maintain community trust, which is our whole purview. So having this be outstanding is probably, I'm going to hazard a guess that the whole COB feels like this is the thing that's being held up that we would most benefit from moving forward, because it's such a recurring line of conversation. In any case where we're talking about bias-free policing, we sort of come to the same stalemate of this threshold is too high. You know, whether we're saying, you know, this is implicit bias, that there needs to be cultural training, or there were comments or actions that we believe were indicate explicit bias, the investigation protocols weren't sufficient for us to sustained, or we disagree with your findings and we sustained, bias-free policing, which, did come up in one of our cases. This is definitely an outstanding sort of hang up in our work that we're not going to be able to come to more fruitful consensus with ACPD on a recurring basis until we have this external support. So, Mummy, I'll pause and see if there was anything you want to add to the bias-free policing kind of best practice scope of work or origination.
Yeah, I feel like this was our probably most complicated and impactful area of work. I think that this was also a good example of where both policy language as well as our interpretation of policy language led to some really interesting discussions. The one case that sticks out to me was one that I think we didn't even necessarily, maybe like wasn't even necessarily anticipated by the existing or the then existing bias-free policing policy, which was the one that we reviewed regarding the young man who had overdosed in the hotel parking lot. And we looked at that as from a bias-free policing lens, and we're looking at whether or not the detective who investigated whether or not he had a next of kin had some biases around whether or not the young man had family that he could contact before that person's body was ultimately cremated. And as we unpacked that, I remember a part of the discussion that became really relevant was whether or not the language of the pre-existing policy fit the scope of that particular situation, because it wasn't necessarily a police initiated action. It was more of a like background investigation piece. And we looked at the policy, I think from our lens, as just the introductory paragraph, which was if you're setting the intention to free any policing practice from the potential negative impacts of bias, then it's looking at all police interactions and not just a police initiated action. So we looked at it from a more, broad sweeping scope, and ACPD kind of narrowed in on a specific piece of the policy that articulated a list of actions that um, they envisioned being the kind of actions that were covered by the scope of that policy. Um, I do want to name that there has been changes to that policy since we've had that discussion, and that's why Ethan's role is important. Not to put you on the spot, Ethan, but I think what has been missing here is our ability to. I saw the draft policy as they were working on it, and so I've had the ability to like have some input, and what I saw even just in the draft stage had incorporated a lot of the pieces of the discussion that we were having. Um, because just as a matter of process, by the time you all review something, um, we've already finished an investigation, we've already had multiple discussions about it, and usually ACPD, you've had the opportunity to see some of the changes that they've made at meetings, like where they've shown this is what the new policy says and that sort of thing. But usually they've already started working on the issue well before we have the public meeting or a formal report is created that puts the recommendation in writing. The bias-free policing one was a kind of like a longer process, and I still think there's always more work to be done, especially in working with an expert and further developing what investigation practices and protocols should look like. But there were changes that were made. I did give additional feedback after I looked at that draft. There should be a final version now up on the website, so probably would be worth going through that. And it doesn't have to necessarily happen in today's meeting, but having some reflections on that, maybe looking at any continuous work that needs to be done. But I know that at least the scope of what sort of interactions could be covered by this policy has been addressed. I still think there's always work to do on how we investigate it and then how we apply it to those circumstances. Obviously, that's where the kind of substance of our discussion was arising from, but I did think it was important to name that, like, sometimes it's not even just about the application of the policy, but we may have some different views about what the policy intends to cover, in terms of just like the language of it. And though that particular piece has been kind of fleshed out a little bit more since our conversation, which I think happened around this time last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think that this represents a very significant opportunity for us to strengthen, the ways in which partnership with ACPD is part of our work, right? Like our interest in being independent is complemented by the fact that, and we've talked about this with them, explicitly, but the more we can work with them to come up with the solutions, right? Like they understand their operating environment, but from our perspective, what are the diverse, what are all of the different perspectives that might be part of the community perspective, and working on that collaboratively. Because, Mami, to your point, and I think something Dave said earlier, that like there have been multiple instances where they've made an improvement before we ever got to a challenge, or once we got to a challenge, we're very open and responsive, like with the collecting the data on guns being drawn and pointed. So, as we get to the end of this recap.
Can I add one thing about the bias?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
please.
just, I'll just agree basically that this is a super fruitful area for collaboration with ACPD. To me, the biggest thing is the ability to create the belief within ACPD that implicit bias is something they can work with. Because right now with this whole single sanction thing, I mean, forget it. It's just not.
Too high of a
Implicit
threshold.
bias just doesn't seem to have a place, because it's either explicit bias, which has this horrendous single sanction, and yet maybe there's never going to be a policy that outlines implicit bias, because maybe it's woven into the way that OPR asks questions to pull out like the background, the kind of thing that you were referring to early. I think that's where the real value is, because if it really is implicit and someone isn't aware of it, the training, as if you will, maybe training's the wrong word, but the investigation hopefully can sort of pull that thinking out, and it's a completely different way for the investigator to think, and it can't lead to. I don't think. Well, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself, because what we've done here is we've asked for expertise to come in, and that's totally the next step. But just sort of thinking ahead anyway, it can't lead to, in my mind, an explicit policy violation, because if it is truly implicit, it's more about teaching and creating better conduct in the future. And I think there's a lot of ways to weave that into either explicit policies like the one Mummy referenced with the investigative technique, the homeless guy, or just really training so that people are more aware of how they're approaching stereotypical situations.
Well, I mean, I think there are at least three sort of separate, pieces that the implicit versus explicit has been sort of our main point of friction. But, there's the investigations of like, do we fully and sufficiently investigate bias? There's what can we do explicitly with policy to address explicit bias, which to Mummy's point, like not all of our findings have been about implicit bias. Some of them are, but some of them have been, officer actions or words that gave us good reason to believe that they had a preconceived notion about what the outcome was going to be, not relating to the situation.
Is there something less than the single sanction?
And then cultural implications, where there are probably practices, protocols, things that ACPD can do culturally for implicit bias that do not penalize any individual officer for, being human.
Right.
Right. So I think there's at least three prongs to that work.
That's good. Yeah.
Right. That, it's got to kind of address the full life cycle. Generally, we want these things to be proactive, but we also need to account for, where there are violations, that there's sufficient accountability. And that single sanction threshold being too high certainly is sort of the driving force of our.
Yeah, it also provides us with a better opportunity to give officers tools and resources to be successful and to be able to, build connection and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's like the other piece in the implicit bias is that we are wanting to explore those situations with a non-punitive lens so that we can figure out where there may be some training gaps or,
Exactly.
Mhm.
whatever type of things, additional resources officers are needing.
As the
to
community
help.
evolves.
And
Exactly.
that part of it, I think, is key because as what we're saying, basically they were effectively paralyzed. And as you were hinting at, because effectively they were paralyzed because of a policy that didn't leave any recourse when you fell short of the worst form of the possible offense.
Right.
So it was written as though everything's the worst form, and there's many instances where you fall short of it. So we can say that the act was violated, but it wasn't the worst offense. So therefore, would that punishment be appropriate? And I think that's where they were effectively paralyzed. So it's a good thing that we are working through this, be it implicit or explicit, or be it how the bias ends up manifesting. Two more questions than needed, or pulling a weapon when not needed.
Right.
You know, these are different things. These are
Right.
different things, and the frequency of these things in a particular individual too, and how those occur. So that's all part of it. Yeah.
Great. Wrapping up, any closing thoughts or questions on sort of the policy discussions that we've had? Or the recap in general? Again, this is sort of like a benchmark we wanted to create. Selena, you came up mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question is more about the wrap up, and I was curious about our pipeline because we've obviously slowed down a bit in our review of cases. So what does the pipeline look like?
Let me get to that in our next update.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll talk about sort of pace. I wanted to we wanted to use this administrative meeting since we didn't have a case that we could review right now to sort of benchmark our progress, our findings, some of our insights, what impact has our work had so far, and start thinking about as we get towards year end, other priorities, other thoughts we have, and reflect those things both to the public and, like we said, to the county manager and county board on, what the impact is to us when we don't have the tools that we need. I'll say that with a little asterisk about budget season. Anyways, going to the chair updates, I want to talk about sort of a couple of different pipelines that we have. So we do have a case that we can review, but we have an outstanding records access issue with ACPD and the county, where the county attorney has, weighed in on our access to records that we think are necessary. So we're waiting on resolution of that. It's really important for all of our cases that we have, clarity and unfettered access to records as, part of meaningful independent oversight. So we're not going to move forward with other cases as of right now. We don't have a backlog of cases. There are a couple that will be ready, for us to review soon. But the challenge we'll have is, anytime we have a records access like we have right now, I mean, we've probably had, depending on who you count, we've had 5 to 10 meetings on this records access issue. And if we move forward with other cases that may have a similar or different issue, we create this sort of like very large administrative backlog that can become untenable. There's just like a lot of threads to pull. So I think for right now, since we do not have, a pile of cases waiting for our attention, we'd prefer to hold and wait until we get that issue addressed so that if it comes up in future cases, we don't, confound the issue. Speaking to other sort of pipeline issues, so we not only now have Ethan, which we're delighted about, as our senior management and policy analyst, but we also have gotten the funds and the temp support for helping us catch up with our reports. So we generated sort of the summary and compiled all of the data that person will need to help us compile drafts of all of the reports we've completed so far, or all of the cases we've completed so far. And what will happen is those draft reports will come to the 2 co-investigation leads to make sure we, individually go through them. She's got, plenty of input data to, verify the information and compile it into the right format. But then those draft reports will come to each of us for, a quality check. Then we'll circulate them to the COB for the COB to just make sure that, especially for any recommendations that we highlight in a written report, that everyone has the chance to weigh in. For those, one thing Dave and I were talking about is there were two aspects of that we want to highlight. One is that we have implicitly covered a part of Mummy's report that's in the ordinance about, was the investigation thorough, accurate, complete? Like, we have implicitly talked about those things, but it wasn't until we used the slide format that we have put that assessment framework kind of to be publicly visible as a standard. And because that's part of the ordinance, that will be part of our reports. We will make sure that the COB has a chance to review those before they're published. Anytime there's been a discrepancy, Mummy has raised it and we've had a conversation, but we want to make sure that in all of our future cases, that's something the COB sort of has a chance with the public audience to go over. And the second thing is, if we're going to make written recommendations that came out of a consensus or a vote, and there's, sometimes there is a divergence within our opinion, that if anyone wants to publish a kind of compendium or different opinion with the report, to add nuance to any recommendation or different perspective, that y'all will have that opportunity as well.
With the time that's passed with some of those reports, for example, we mentioned how we made recommendations, ACPD, thank you, has made some changes. Since we have an opportunity with these reports, because time has passed, are we going to have like little addendum that says, oh, and to catch you up, there actually was a change or anything like that? Or we just, because we won't be able to do that going forward, we're not going to start doing that?
ACPD has the opportunity to, they don't have to respond to each of our reports, but presumably for any recommendations we publish, they will be able to publish. And it's probably better that those updates come from them, just so they can say specifically either what has been done or what's in a plan. Because some of the policies, I think, have to go through a process. So it's possible they've made the decision to change it,
right,
but it hasn't been final. We don't want to take, we don't want to get out, draw color outside of our lines. But I do think that the other thing that will be helpful about, having temp support to catch up from this sort of paperwork backlog is that we are going to kind of prepare sort of like this 2-year recap of investigations. We have a lot more meaningful substance for an annual report to put out that aggregates, right? What is the collective list of recommendations? That these are sort of our policy discussions, things that we've had a recurring, emphasis and have tried to solution. But some of the smaller, recommendations can give the community insight into, the more detailed pieces of the puzzle. So Selena, does that get into some of your question about the case load?
It does. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
I don't know how much you're at liberty to discuss in sort of a public meeting, but I'm curious just to know a little bit more. Like, can you talk about the records access issue? And does it mean that we need to start looking at revisions to the statute? Or I guess another question I had is that both the COB and ACPD are within the county. Is there a sort of a legal conflict, or, is it hard to resolve these legal issues given that we sort of, I would imagine, work under the same attorney?
So I'm going to speak at a high level, which is that we have our own independent counsel, partly because we have subpoena power. So the COB, has independent counsel because we are civilian volunteers, involved in this work, but also because we have subpoena power to, ask for information that we're not being given access to. For example, in a previous case, there were juvenile records, and there was a question about whether or not records we had been given access to were juvenile records, and what constitutes a record, and how does that affect ACPD's ability to participate in the conversation. And in that instance, the county attorney at the time interpreted the language in the ordinance, which is the local policy, right? The statute, I think, being the state level law that authorized oversight, right? The local ordinance that Arlington put in place to authorize the COB specifically precluded juvenile records access, which is an issue we've raised with them because the consensus from the COB that I suspect, is still the case was that it's deeply concerning that we wouldn't have access to juvenile records because those are especially vulnerable members of the community when, engaged with law enforcement. In this instance, it's a different type of records access issue. And there we have sort of a difference of opinion, but we've got sort of a triage of options to work through. And so we have met with, the county manager, the county board, the county attorney, ACPD, the IPA, in different groups and all together to come up with a constructive, list of options that, would get us to a place where we feel like we can have a meaningful public discussion about a case that we, think is important for the transparency purpose of our mission, transparency and accountability. But until we get sort of through each stage, I guess I think I'm a little bit reluctant to get too much into the details because there is a joint effort to come to a constructive resolution. But there is, frustration, from the COB at least that, the national best practice is unfettered access to records, and that sort of points to some of these specific challenges that we've run into now at least twice. And so wanting to sort of figure out what's the best way in this instance, like the previous instance, the county attorney's interpretation is partly about the legal liability that the county or ACPD or individual officers face in sharing those records. And so there's a couple of different ways we can go about handling that, and figuring out which option is going to be fruitful, is sort of still in the works. I know that's sort of opaque. Mummy, is there anything you'd like to add to clarify?
Yes, and I apologize in advance, Julie, because I'm probably going to go a little bit of a different direction than you, but I will take full ownership and responsibility. I do think this is an area where COB and members of the public deserve a little more transparency, and I don't find it to be controversial to be transparent here. But apologies in advance if it steps on any toes. But I also think it helps to facilitate how the dialogue is being received and interpreted. Sometimes in being too vague, people may assume that it's a worse problem than it is or what have you. It's a very technical issue. So let's unpack it a little bit. I'm gonna try to be succinct. And I think it's also worth talking about what we're having to navigate to give to shed some light into how much of our operational capacity and time goes into the workload management and just what's going on behind the scenes, even when we are not necessarily reviewing an investigation. There's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes where still very much in the building phase, even 3 years in, trying to figure out how to work through some of these obstacles. And whether it's a juvenile issue or then the one that came up in this issue, sometimes it takes for an investigation to come up to, shed light on an issue, and then we have to figure out a solution. So this particular records access issue came about because there was a sexual assault complaint, or a sexual assault related complaint where a woman filed a complaint against a detective, complaining that they failed to investigate an alleged sexual assault that took place between her and a partner. That was the scope of the complaint, and kind of the allegation that we were specifically looking at. And I had an opportunity to sit in on the interview and do all of the collaborative investigation. The issue became then when we needed to turn over the records, because there is a section of the Virginia Code, I believe it's 19.2, but don't quote me on that, that specifically protects the identity of sexual assault victims. And the concern was whether or not sharing this information with my office or the COB, specifically, the incident report or specific records that may directly or indirectly identify the woman who was the complainant, would subject the county and specifically the police department as the custodian of those records to liability. It was our position that those records could be redacted in certain fashions and for us to accomplish the goal, which was a very similar position that we took in the juvenile records access issue. But ultimately, we are not the custodians of those records. So we are in a position where, with the assistance of outside counsel, we are making recommendations as to how we think that or suggestions of how we think that this issue can be resolved. But ultimately, like, we have to have the buy-in or the sign off from the parties who are, I guess, most at risk, which is the county or the police department, to agree to move forward in that fashion. That particular code of the Virginia, that particular section of the Virginia Code has a specific allotment that allows for a custodian of the records to share access with written permission from the sexual assault victim. So obviously that was the first recommendation that I made, which was, let's get her consent and then we can move forward with reviewing this complaint and mitigate everyone's liability. That was kind of the issue that we needed to parse through. And that took 1,000 meetings, as Julie mentioned, but it was the issue of first impression, and we had to figure out, like, how do we approach that conversation and just address like different sensitivities around that, because obviously, this complainant has had now multiple interactions with the police department, and we wanted to make sure that however we were to get that woman's consent to move forward with processing the complaint, that dialogue was approached in a way that was sensitive and also informed, trauma informed specifically, and also was going to give that person also access to us as a resource if they needed additional information about like what the process looks like. So as a result of that conversation, the police department did agree to reach out to the complainant, but the county attorney's office is currently working on creating language for a waiver that we can use both in this case as well as moving forward. So I think that's one positive that came out of this, and also part of why this conversation took longer was because we were trying to figure out solutions that were not going to just meet the needs of this particular case, but also, preventing this in the future from becoming an issue. The other thing is that the police department has agreed to include language in their actual intake form. Sorry for the background noise, y'all. That will give people information on the front end to let them know that there is another, entity, in our case, the Civilian Oversight Agency, that will then need access to the records in order to investigate complaints, so people can proactively provide their consent and then, fill out a waiver or whatever in specific circumstances where those things may be needed. So there's a lot of work that just goes into navigating these situations, but in resolving one, we are also creating systems of other solutions. And then I do want to go back to your question, Selena, about legislation. But I'll yield in case we have any more questions about this specific records access issue. And then I will, in my update, talk about some of the legislative ways in which we are trying to address this records access issue at large.
I only add one piece of context that goes with the level of detail you shared, Mummy, which is there is a specific stipulation in the state law governing sexual assault victims records access, one being written consent and the other being if determined by a court for good cause. And with our subpoena power, there is a case to be made that, there is good cause for, the public interest in reviewing this kind of situation for improving, related policing activities. So those are, again, there's like a couple of different conversations and possible paths forward. And depending on the outcomes of different things, we're still trying to figure out what the best path to resolution is. But the other thing I want to highlight from what Mummy said is, this board in particular has a lot of differences than other commissions, right? We don't meet in the other room. Like we have some, we have administrative challenges, administering public comment and, different things. Like we've had lots of different sort of reasons to think that we're special. But there is a lot of work to getting us, from 0 to fully functional. And, especially because we didn't have, staff support for a period of time, especially because, we've had a lot of work to do in the background to get some of the support needs that we have justified and budgeted and funded and approved and then moved along. I mean, all of this stuff is sort of background labor, right? That has to go in between the public meetings. And so, in the first 2 years I was going through and compiling all this data, what Dave and I were talking about, some of the specific meeting requirements for commissions. And, part of the reason I wanted this to be hybrid is, I know it can be taxing to like spend a weeknight in a community board room, not so much for me tonight, but that, where we can have that flexibility. But in the first 2 years of meeting, we like more than doubled, our required number of meetings. The first year that was because of the very extensive training. It was like 3 times a week for a while. And then in the second year, it was to, clear the quote unquote backlog that the county board, put in front of us to make sure that we were meeting twice a month to be able to go through those things very quickly. And so, right now, for example, we did not meet in our last scheduled meeting because we thought that it was more important to have, prioritize the time with all of the different stakeholders to say, okay, we've now had 5 or 6 meetings in small groups that are clearly not coming to, consensus and a path towards resolution. Let's go ahead and do that. So sometimes when we skip public meetings, it's not because we're all on vacation and it's summer. It's because there's, a lot of background work to make sure that we can have meaningful conversations where we have productive, efforts towards both transparency and accountability that serve our mission of increasing and maintaining public trust in law enforcement. So I want to highlight that. I want to give Joshua a chance to weigh in, and then Mommy, I've got one more quick update before we get to legislative. Thanks. Joshua?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just want to say it's not going to add too much here. But one of the things that, from at least my perspective, I'm a co-lead on the case that has the Records Act issue. I do have to say, like, I give a lot of props to Mummy and Julie in this regard because they've been in more meetings than I have about this issue. I've been in some of them. I personally kind of found it particularly frustrating. I think a good benefit, again, from especially the work that Julie and Mummy are doing at this is making sure this isn't a one-off, right? Like they said, making sure that we do have these avenues going forward so it becomes a non-issue. And that is something I can appreciate. Again, my frustration personally just came from like this is largely a non-issue to me because it's kind of like what, Julie said at first, which is to put it kind of more bluntly, like they're just an interpretation difference between the county and specifically what, ACPD and their council's been telling them and kind of how you, as in the COB, in the first instance, the co-leads, but specifically me, just speaking for myself, you read kind of the language. I frankly think it's silly. I think that's, like if what I heard was accurate, that was a silly interpretation. And I don't know why people are making such a big issue out of it. But I do appreciate that people have, different perspectives. And that, again, I think the benefit that we can all kind of take away, including myself, that I had to like make myself feel better because I have, not going to lie, at different organizations used different avenues, whether it be FOIA or suing my own organization to get information that they would not provide to me. And it has worked because of silly interpretations. Like, I do appreciate that, again, like rather than having this be a one-off or rather than having this be a, well, let's really dig in about this issue, that to your point, things like the form and the waiver, to me, it's redundant. Like you have a statute, the statute's not implicated here. They say it is. Okay. But it's kind of like, if you think it is, what is a way to, of course, fit that need? So, the county doesn't look at this and of course, just kind of be like, oh, we can't touch it each time. And ultimately, of course, that's, we have to work with stakeholders. And as long as people are comfortable making sure their interests are protected, I don't really much care, right? If we just add a redundancy in my head, just making sure that everybody's good going forward. But I do have to just add in that layer that while we have slowed down on this particular issue, again, I think the benefit is we are actually creating processes for this and future issues. And I just wanted to personally say that I do appreciate Julie and Mummy's work because I think that, while I am capable of it, I think my patience was a little bit worn thin on some of these meetings. So I appreciate what you guys did there, but I'll just kind of just wanted to add that bit that, again, I think the important takeaway is, even though it does seem like, oh, we had this case, what happened to it? I do actually have kind of a hopeful perspective that this will make other cases go faster, even when this one did slow down a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua.
I always want to take opportunities, but especially in a sort of 2-year retrospective, to say Mummy is a core anchor of our work, and her leadership and energy have really made any and all of this possible. I lean on her definitely even more than I probably should, and have learned a lot in that process. I think specifically to that, I want to say in this instance, it does, like, 2 data points are not a pattern, but where we're dealing with very severe issues and we're dealing with specifically vulnerable populations, it does feel especially important that we not accept a status quo that records access can become a recurring barrier to transparent oversight and accountability in Arlington, because while our original ordinance may not have anticipated all of these specific issues or aligned with, public opinion, as we have opportunities to review them, that is certainly our purview and prerogative. And it is not the kind of community where I think, the members of the public would be satisfied to feel like, well, we go through all of these motions, but whenever it's too sensitive or difficult or complicated, we just say we can't do that. We don't want to stand behind. That's like a very well-established NACOL, National Association of Community Law Enforcement Oversight Entities, I think, best practice is that, like, unfettered records access is essential to this work. So Joshua, I appreciate you highlighting that piece. Mummy, I appreciate just all of your leadership and energy into this. And Selena, I want to see if you have any questions, or Lisa, if there's other kind of board member questions on the topic before we move on.
None for me. Thanks. That was very helpful for me.
Cool.
Not me either. Thanks.
Okay. November. We had originally on our scheduling document, November 12th, which I had moved up because I thought that the following week was Thanksgiving, but it's actually the 4th week. And I don't have complete poll participation from the group. So I'm going to follow up with folks so that you guys have a chance to check your calendar. But the 12th, if we pick the 19th, which was not our kind of current schedule, I think we might have an opportunity to, prepare more kind of substantive updates, whether that's a case or, get the records issue addressed. But I do know that also gets into holiday adjacent time period. So I will ping the group by text or circulate a poll so that you guys can indicate that. But the 12th or the 19th are sort of the 2 options. So think about that. And I will look at whether or not we need to do all virtual or in person, sort of depending on people's attendance options. So that's all I have from chair updates, except that I think this is our 2nd meeting to welcome Ethan. Or is this our first meeting?
It's my first meeting.
Oh my gosh. Sorry, I feel like I've seen you so much. Well, okay, this should probably be Mummy's updates as well, but Ethan is our new senior policy and management analyst, or maybe that's backwards, but we have already had lots of occasion to work together and start sort of organizing different pieces of the process that were very slow because they were sort of dependent on, different members of us who were already overburdened, keeping things moving. And Ethan is really helping us pick things up and get things moving. So can I give you a second to sort of introduce yourself? And I'm so sorry.
No, it's
what
fine,
a huge
fine.
glaring oversight.
Totally fine. So, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Ethan. Very excited to be here. I am coming from 6 years at the Department of Justice, where I did national investigations into policing issues across the country, as well as corrections facilities, nursing homes, and juvenile facilities as well. Prior to that, I was with the DC government's Office of Police Complaints, where I was an investigator for police misconduct with Metropolitan Police Department. That was a civilian oversight entity too. So this isn't my first go around in civilian oversight. When I was at DOJ, we worked pretty closely with civilian oversight entities and consent decree jurisdictions and things like that. So really excited to be able to continue doing this work with you all and learning a lot since I've been here about a month and a half now, and very happy to be here. So looking forward to getting to know you all.
All right, well, thank you and welcome. We're very excited. I actually will bring cake next time and we'll do a beginning of the meeting. I'll give you a chance so the public hasn't.
That was a record now.
It's awesome. I will bring cake to the next meeting to make up for my very serious oversight in introducing our newest asset and sharing that excitement with the community when they might have still been listening. So we will redo it, Ethan. I will make it up to you with cake and pomp and circumstance. Okay, that's all from me. I'm going to pass it to Mummy for her report out, and then we will do public comment, open discussion, and adjourn. Mummy?
Thank you. Yeah, that was actually going to be my first item on my report out, was to introduce Ethan and just talk a little bit about the work that we are kind of co-designing for his position. Due to budget constraints, I had to kind of reimagine what was traditionally Ian's role as a management analyst, and we reclassified the position to senior management analyst to add in the policy element. So to close the loop on my thought earlier about why it was like Ethan's role is important now, is because as a result of a lot of the investigations that we're working on, obviously we're having policy discussions, obviously in reports, we're making policy recommendations, but we need someone to take it from a recommendation into working in collaboration with the police department to make the changes happen. And also, I would love for us to have capacity to do proactive policy change. And that wasn't something that we had the capacity to do beforehand, because the bulk of my time is spent doing investigations. So now, hoping with Ethan being present, that we have the ability to kind of fill that body of work. It also gives me a wonderful opportunity to use the joke that I've now called in the feds, and I use that at every opportunity I can. Before I go into any other updates I have, though, I did want to recognize that one of our county board members and now county COB liaison is present on the call, and thank you for being here, JD Spain. And I also wanted to yield the floor to you in case you wanted to provide any comments, and just be respectful of your time, because I'm not sure if you were planning to be here for the whole time or not. So I'm going to just yield to you real quick, and then I'll go back to my updates.
Madam IPA, you are so generous. Your chair just had me dingling out here for the past hour. I guess she just wanted me to watch her in action, and that's okay. I don't even know if I need a cake or not. Maybe I'll get one. We'll see.
Maybe I just give you a cake.
I'm about to yield the floor back.
So we have, let's me back up for a second. I'm not officially COB liaison yet, but in due time, we believe that will happen effective 1 January. I would say I'm here today solely just to listen in, get that bird's eye view. I have, as I've stated earlier, very passionate about this area of work. All right. Simply because if you don't know, many in the community may say, because of some level of advocacy that I took on and many others, we are the impetus of the the Community Oversight Board here today. So I've seen it from when it was us people walking in the streets and sending emails and advocating to where it's at today, now 2 years removed, but also understand that there is still more work to be done. So to Ethan, who's on board, thank you. Yeah, the feds have arrived. Thank you for being on board and willing to be a key player. Joshua, I just want you to know that I heard you loud and clear and to some of your concerns. And I hope that when I, circle the wagon, end up getting on the COB officially, that we are able to take on these challenges and remove any barriers that keep the IPA and the Community Oversight Board from doing really good, robust work, and ultimately land us in a place where we are not only ideal Community Oversight Board, but one for others we can emulate. They can emulate us, and that's the type of vision and the direction I'm looking to go in. I know Mummy's going to talk about some issues with legislation, perhaps. If you've watched our recess board meeting yesterday, we are primed to take on a few areas relating to records, but also perhaps doing some things with the IPA, I believe, to bring that role under the direct supervision of the county board. We shall see. That being said, thank you for yielding the time to me, Madam IPA. It is a pleasure to be in this space, Madam Chair. To all of you who have taken time out of your schedule to be here today, thank you, thank you, thank you. I understand that a lot of times you come in this space away from family, away from, you've had a long day at work, perhaps you're like, oh my goodness, another virtual meeting. Do I have to do this? But your willingness to be here and just being present and being active, this is where the rubber meets the road. And we need you now more so than ever. So thank you again. And thank you for the opportunity. I will probably leave at around 8:30. But again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And I look forward to working alongside you. Have a good evening.
You, Mummy.
Thank you, JD, for being here and for providing some comments. All right, so back to the report out. Let's go back into the records access issue. And Julie, I just wanted to also name that I appreciate your kind of hesitation to go into the depths of it, just not kind of necessarily, just wanting to, I guess, speak to or be sensitive to the ongoing kind of nature of how we're trying to resolve the issue. I think that's a very mature and respectful instinct, and I appreciate that you had that instinct. And I just having, I think, probably a little bit more day-to-day conversation about where we're at with that and the kind of sentiments around it. I did feel like it was at a good place, and I also don't want members of the public to interpret that as a aversion to transparency, but transparency and relationship building is you're striking a balance of this information will obviously become a part of a public conversation. We're going to review this case publicly, but sometimes while some of these conversations and frankly negotiations sometimes are still being had, it's not necessarily the right timing to go into details about certain things. So I just wanted to amplify that and just offer some appreciation as to why you had some hesitation there, and just explain a little bit more context for anyone that may watch it and maybe not understand what that could be about, and how that's helpful to just think intentionally about how information is shared and when it's the most impactful and appropriate time, but not because we don't want to share information. So anyways, the records access issue, as we mentioned earlier, it's about a specific case, but before then it was about a different case. And we've had several different instances that, we've had to work through records access issues, and they continue to arise. So there is specific things in the ordinance, chapter 69 in the Arlington County Code that created our oversight agency that enumerates things that we do not have access to, like juvenile records. And then there's kind of a catch-all language or otherwise records access that's otherwise restricted by law, which then, kind of creates a little catch-all area where other issues are arising that we didn't necessarily know. we're going to be issues like sexual assault victims or domestic violence victims or different things like that that may come up. So obviously we're trying to respond to those specific issues in real time, but I'm also, going back to what Julie was mentioning, which is, unfettered access, which has been the, issue that I have been unwaveringly, asking for and trying to create um, in in our work, because it's just pivotal to what we're doing here. It is one of the 13 principles of civilian oversight. What unfettered access looks like. Our ordinance says full access. And obviously, what full access means, I interpret as unfettered, or we interpret it, in civilian oversight as unfettered. But that differs, candidly, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The kind of big picture issue or solution that I've been trying to kind of bring us back to with the number of times that records access issues have become part of the dialogue, or really every time it becomes part of the dialogue, my larger conversation is, how do we get to a place where we have unfettered access, right? Like, we can keep resolving these like one-off issues, or we can try to figure out a system where these issues are less likely to arise. And in that regard, I am looking at CJIS certification, which is Criminal Justice Information Systems. This is a certification that allows for the person who has that certification to access criminal justice information systems, and have access to like NCIC records and different things like that, which I'm hoping will alleviate some of the records access issues where there is concern that sharing records may create liability. Essentially, it's an extra level of protection. You have to go through this FBI kind of generated certification process. You have to maintain certain security protocols in order to continue to have access. But it would, in practice, allow me or any holder of this certification to have full access to evidence.com or Axon IA Pro, which is the intake system that the police department uses. Blue Teams is another, case management system that they use to manage, digital records. I'd be able to fully access like disciplinary history, case records, different things like that, without it having to go through a redaction process, but also would alleviate the records access issues in terms of who's allowed to have access to these things. But whether or not we can get CJIS certification is, contingent on a lot of different things. Are we a criminal justice agency? Are we a non-criminal justice agency? It has a lot of implications in the code that we are trying to work through to create a larger solution. But we are trying to figure out if there is some larger legislative fix that we can try to put forward, or if we need to create like a work group or something of that nature to kind of work through what sort of language in the Virginia Code or the correlating federal statute that would help. Basically, the way I can put it in layman's terms is like, civilian oversight was created in Virginia and in various other jurisdictions across the country, but the language in the code in terms of criminal justice agencies has not caught up with that. Inspector generals have been added to the federal statute, but not namely civilian oversight agencies. So then it leaves some interpretation as to whether or not we belong in that category or we don't. Obviously, our position is that we do, but we're trying to work through those things. And then on a smaller scale, we're also looking at proposing language that just specifically addresses the aspects of Virginia code that we have had problems with, like the sexual assault victim things, is to add civilian oversight agencies specifically to the list of agencies that are entitled to access to those records, so that we can at least solve those, issues that we're already aware of. But I'm looking for to push a larger solution, and I hope that that is CJIS, but that could be part of a longer conversation and probably a work group. So it may not be this legislative session, but I'm at least hopeful that we can address some of these specific Virginia Code sections in the meantime. So that's what we're kind of working through in terms of a legislative packet for this upcoming session. But this is still very much in the works in terms of conversations and trying to figure out what that language looks like and what can be put forward and what can't be. But that those are how we are trying to take some of the records access issues and turn them into some form of legislative response.
Did you mean to go on mute?
Are there any questions or reactions to that before I move on?
No, but you're going on mute, so we're not clear if we're missing something. You were saying about the legislative updates?
You're on mute right now.
Sorry, Kitty's having a meltdown in the background. I didn't hear the comment. Was there a question?
No, sorry. I just wasn't sure if we heard everything that you said. Just so that you know, we can't hear anything in the background. Teams is doing a pretty good job filtering anything else out. So you're probably good on off mute. I don't have any questions. Does the other rest of the COB have questions about the legislative updates?
No, I don't.
But just a
Thank
point
God for Teams' background noise filter. I'm sorry, go ahead, Charles.
just point of clarification, again, for those online, because we are intertwined, but in some ways we appear joined, but we're more intertwined than joined. So just to clarify then, the intent, especially since you bring up the ability that you have as an IPA to seek this certification, but again, that wouldn't be that we're looking at for COB board members. So to go back to our legislative package, is it looking at moving us, IPA and COB, to have the same level of access in that one route? Or are we looking at what the IPA needs first and then working on what that access looks like to COB second?
That's a great question. I don't know what we're ultimately going to land on. I will say that there are different levels of CJIS certification. I also wanted to mention that like CJIS certification is a national practice among civilian oversight agencies. Like this is not an issue of first impression. Like there are many civilian oversight agencies that have CJIS certification. Not all of them have COB, so that this is like an additional layer of consideration. But the ones that do have COBs, usually what they may do is just have the county employee, the auditor, monitor at one level of certification, and then the COB at a separate level of certification, which just may look like you don't have necessarily, you may not have access to IA Pro and Blue teams, but the idea would still be for you to have the ability to look at least records on Axon in a way that doesn't have to go through the same redaction and filtration process. Is that helpful?
Yes, very much so.
Do you have other updates, Mummy?
Yes, just was trying to give a second in case anybody else was needing to mull through that. I believe that I sent out, because I wrote a like 7-page, memo about this issue. If I didn't send it out to the whole group, I might have sent it to Julie and Dave just because they were part of some of these conversations. But if I didn't send it to the whole group, which I think I did, please let me know. I'm happy to circulate that. It goes into more detail about the specific statutes that we're discussing here, and it just will probably help to put the conversation in a little bit more context, because it's a lot. It's a lot to just try to talk about succinctly. But
I was gonna say,
I will keep you all
Mummy,
updated.
if we don't have a case at our next meeting, I think it might be useful to sort of extrapolate that into a briefing where we could walk folks through, because I think that's a lot of information to try to follow. And
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I've seen that memo, but I don't know if that went out to the whole COB. So I think that's something that would be useful for a follow-up, like more in-depth conversation. Just to like give some, context and references and visual aids so that everyone can absorb like the different facets and to Charles's point, like distinctions.
That'll make sense. Happy to do that. I will circulate that to you all just in case.
Mummy, you sent it to all of us. It's in our inbox on October 3rd.
Wonderful. I'm glad to know that my memory is not that bad. Thank you, Joshua. So, the other thing I just wanted to say is that there are a couple of other cases in the queue that I've completed investigations on. I'm just working through what the order of those may be, and then I will send out reports. There is one that also includes the juvenile issue, so I'm gonna have to work through that as well with whoever the leads are on that case. But I will probably circulate a little just list of which cases those are, as well as a little blurb about what those cases are about, and link the Axon records so that if anybody wants to kind of try to get a preview of like what's in the queue, I think Selena referred to it as earlier, you'll have some information kind of going into that. But I do think we're gonna stick to working through the records access issue so we can review the case that we've already prepared, and then move into the next one after that. And I'm just not sure. It shouldn't be hopefully too much longer. We're just waiting, like I said, on the waiver. But I will keep you all posted as soon as I get information on that. And then the last thing is I wanted to just yield the floor to Ethan, if you don't mind, to just provide an update on where we're at with the temporary support for the COB. And I think Julie mentioned it earlier, but just in case anybody like just joined us or didn't necessarily follow, just to kind of briefly highlight what we are, or maybe Julie can cover this part, what we're looking for that support staff person to be working on. But Ethan, I specifically wanted to thank you and congratulate you on getting that process like underway and getting it completed. And just if you want to give an update on where we're at with that process, I would greatly appreciate it. And thank you for all the work you did to make it happen.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a candidate who's been selected and has accepted the offer to come on for temporary support. They are currently in the stages of getting fingerprinted and background checked. Once that happens, they'll be able to start getting onboarded. I've started to put together some high-level materials to kind of just help them get more acclimated to sort of the history of the COB and IPA and things like that, and kind of help get them up to speed with the backlog and sort of some of the things that they're going to be working on. So that process is moving along. I'm very hopeful that I think they're scheduled to get fingerprinted in the next 2 days or so. So that should hopefully get moving pretty quickly. But Julie, if you want to talk about some of the work you'll have them do.
No, I think we covered before the record stuff. I think we've talked quite a bit about our sort of administrative backlog and lack of staffing. So I'm mostly just excited that we have you and our new support team member. But I echo Mummy's gratitude for helping us move it forward. It's definitely been a hangnail.
Yeah, I'm just excited to be able to contribute. So.
Yeah, thank you. Mummy?
That was it for me in terms of updates. I'm happy to answer any questions or provide space for people to have any reflections if they wanted to.
Team?
That's for me.
Okay. Public comment. I don't think we have any members of the public on here. I think most of the questions were in the chat got answered by Mummy or COB members. Can you go all the way up? Yeah. So the time span for the violations policy, just going back to our previous slides, was 2 years.
Yeah, no, Mummy answered it.
Yeah.
Answered Joshua.
Was it about personal contact?
Yeah. The next one.
Potentially outstanding question, I think, from Peter was, I don't think he understood. This was kind of what, somebody I forgot was you, Lisa, or Cecilia. But what Selena, excuse me, is where I don't think there's an understanding what personal context means. So I was wondering if we could maybe just read that, at least the beginning out part, for the public so they know that when you see a personal context violation allegation, what that means.
414, personal contacts. The employee shall be responsive to the needs of the public by rendering prompt and courteous service and consistently conducting themselves in a manner that encourages public respect. Employees are expected to conduct themselves in a professional manner at all times. Employees will treat all persons with respect and will not use degrading, profane, abusive, or defamatory language when in contact with the public toward other employees or when in public view. Employees are expected to be courteous and dignified at all times as the circumstances allow. The personal biases or attitudes of the employee must not influence their decision to take police action other than what is justified or expected within the constraints of discretion.
So thank you. So personal context, just going back to sort of the slide that originated at the sort of three of the four most frequent policy violation allegations are these sort of generalized policies. Personal context being, how do officers conduct themselves in their interactions? So in one of the cases that we talked about, a member of the public was asking for a reason they were stopped. And while there is not a requirement for them to do so, there was sort of an escalating tension, and it did not seem that there was a good reason not to tell the person why they were being pulled over in a traffic stop, especially because I think in that instance, it was a black driver, where there was a pretty palpable sense that, answering the question was part of what, we deem being courteous. So personal context comes up very frequently because, it can be the subjective matter of perception between a member of the public and ACPD, whether that's the officer or OPR. And it's also been an area where, and I think you said this, in some instances, we recognize that we're Monday night quarterbacking a very difficult situation. In other instances, OPR has acknowledged that they don't believe that a situation was handled in the way that they would have handled it, or, best practice, but it not necessarily constituting a policy violation. And so personal context specifically does get into some of the judgment or gray area where, we have opportunities to talk about. And I think we raised this in that specific meeting, but when we did the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy training day in January of 2023, which I know from my data aggregation, was that one of the officers I went around and did the training with said to me that it's his personal standard that after he completes a traffic stop that he, conduct himself in a way that prompts the person to say thank you, that's sort of his feedback signal. And it seemed like a very, genuine expression of like holding himself to a higher standard than the policy, minimum, that it's not only my job to keep the public safe, but also to make sure that I have interactions that feel courteous and respectful. And so, we have had instances where, whether it was swearing or, a kind of under the breath comment that was negative, we've also, had occasion to see ACPD officers, represent a very positive standard of that subjective conduct. So having no other members of the public, I'm going to go ahead and move on to open discussion for COB members. Anything top of mind, questions, administrative, logistics, ideas? Oh, Joshua.
I just had a quick question. I thought at the beginning we said that we were not adopting the last minutes. Do we not have a quorum to do that? Or is there another reason we're not doing it?
We have to have a physical quorum in a hybrid meeting. So we'd have to have 5 people in this room in order to take a vote.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In an all virtual meeting, that's not the case, obviously, but we are only allowed to all virtual meetings and not back to back. Good question. Thank you. Can we keep us accountable to procedure?
While we're at it, when we talk about dates, there's something for the dates. Do you want to also do December too? Because that will be just as broad as November potentially. So just want to at least send out test dates for both.
I will send out dates for both at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. We'll confirm that and make sure we get that posted as soon as possible. Okay. Wrapping up then, I'll just say I really appreciate everyone making time for, what was a long but I think meaningful meeting. I would like any sort of feedback from individual members on either the slides. I made some notes about questions you had about how can we contextualize or analyze the data, whether it's in future iterations or as trend analysis, things like that. So I also am going to share the spreadsheet I created to aggregate data from, like, we have 5 different sources of data. None of them are complete. Some of them have errors. So we're gonna work on that so that, but it is really valuable to have, that ability to analyze data and, making sure that Ethan has access to that we keep it up to date and that we're able to use it for different things, I think will be useful. But I am not a data scientist, and so giving you guys raw access to it, I think will also give us an opportunity to think about what we have in the future. So other closing items, I'm going to say, Mummy, I thought you were going to say that your first order of business was to censure me for not recognizing Ethan. I couldn't see the chat. I can't see which one of you are online. JD, I'm really grateful for you welcoming us. I want to echo what you said. In the same way that we would not be as far along in this process as we are without Mummy, I suspect we would not have a COB without you. I think, for members of the public that really are either new to this or haven't, followed this, JD has been involved in this work since even before he was on the county board, and, definitely met the moment of need and organizing, and is just like a pillar and model of what sustained kind of attention and collaboration can bring to fruition. We have had multiple times, we have had members of neighboring COBs or oversight bodies come to our meetings and tell us how much farther along we are in a much shorter period of time than they are, that, we're able to do a lot more activity and depth. And so I still feel like we're, getting the polishing corners of the full process. I think we have had so many accomplishments and milestones. Again, I think that it's easy to look at this and say, we don't have enough information to draw strong conclusions or whatever, but I think the conversations we've had are really meaningful. I think the insight to the board is really meaningful. I think the relationship with the county managers, staff, getting through these records, access issues. One thing I'll just reflect as a closing thought on kind of a 2-year reflection is we had many obstacles early on to meaningful community engagement. We have had more community engagement activity this year than we had last year, but we are still really working on making that not just a priority, but a recurring kind of open access. So for anyone who's still listening, and we'll open with this next time, but for any members of the community, whether they're part of a group or individually who know of opportunities or groups that would be interested to hear from us, we're happy to send, representatives to talk with, whether it's neighborhood associations, community groups. We do really want to make sure we continue to think about those opportunities. It is challenging given our workload right now, but that is always a high priority for us, because it has been in those interactions with members of the public that we understand, facets of the community perspective that might be outside of our own personal experience or, sort of awareness. So any community members that would like COB or IPA sort of participation in their meeting, we're always happy to do that. Since we did not do the agenda items, I can't declare the meeting adjourned. Is there a motion to adjourn?
We adjourn.
Do I have a second to the motion to adjourn?
Sure, I'll second.
Charles seconds. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Excellent. Okay, I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
All right. Good meeting.
Bye.
Have a good-
Bye.
Everybody.
Good night.